Okay, welcome back to another edition of Durham Storytime, or whatever you want to call this. Um, but today I'm going to tell you about Slaughterhouse-5 by Kurt Vonnegut. So let's get right to it, because it is kind of a difficult book to explain to anyone. So let's get to the screen here. So first, you see what's important here is that the book itself was written in 1969, and you see the whole title there. I'm not really sure what the whole title means. I know what Slaughterhouse-5 means, and you'll soon find out, but the rest of it, who knows? It's written by Kurt Vonnegut, and you see him there. There's I don't know what to say about Kurt Vonnegut. He's just a brilliant writer, and I think you'll see from this book that he was. And this, personally, this isn't even my favorite Vonnegut book, but it's amazing. And you can kind of see, if you can see in the small picture, it's not a very big book. It's only a couple hundred pages, so you can read this pretty fast, and it's a great read. It's one of those books that you don't want to stop reading, as are probably most of the books on this list. People have been hard-pressed to define what Slaughterhouse-5 is, if you're into defining things. Some people say it's a dark comedy. There certainly is some humor in it. Some people say it's a science fiction novel, which there's science fiction in it. Some people say it's a war novel. And there's certainly some autobiographical aspects of the war, of World War II in this. Or maybe it's an anti-war novel, who knows? But we'll get to maybe that at the end. Really, the main thing that we're going to talk about is like fate versus free will, and how this applies to war, especially, and really anything you do in your life. So it's listed on the most challenged books by the American Library Association. It's been banned a lot. You can see that there's some reasons why. There's some obscene content and language, which when I get to reading some things I might skip over. First, to recognize homosexuals as victims of the Holocaust. That's right, it took a novel like this to do that in 1969, and it does talk about sex in it, and so it has been banned from libraries and schools and things across the country. Just to give you some historical context, the main character, Billy Pilgrim, is in Dresden, Germany during World War II, that should say. And if you know what happened in Dresden over the course of 2 nights in February 1945, this is near the end of World War II. British and American bombers firebombed this city. So the bombs that they were using were meant to catch the city on fire. There really wasn't much in the city. It was, as you can see there by the slide, an open and undefended city. There was some rumors that there was some military importance to the city, but there really wasn't. So most of the 110,000 or more people that were killed there were civilians, and were women and children, because that's about all that was left in a lot of these big cities in Germany. And the United States and British did this. Here's what Dresden looks like today. And probably it did then. And you can see what it looked like after the American bombing of the firebombing, the American and British firebombing. And if you look at the picture in the bottom right and you see all the bodies, that's a memorable event for Kurt Vonnegut, because he was there. This is one of the things that Kurt Vonnegut did while he was in World War II. He was a prisoner of war in Dresden, being held in Dresden, and after the bombing, he helped bury the bodies. And so I'm going to read you a section of that. Prisoners of war from many lands came together that morning at such and such a place in Dresden. It had been decreed that here was where the digging for bodies was to begin. So the digging began. Billy's the main character of the novel. Billy found himself paired as a digger with a Maori who had been captured at Tobruk. The Maori was chocolate brown. He had whirlpools tattooed on his forehead and his cheeks. Billy and the Maori dug into the inert, unpromising gravel of the moon. The materials were loose, so there was constant little avalanches. Many holes were dug at once. Nobody knew yet what there was to find. Most holes came to nothing, to pavement or to boulders so huge they would not move. There was no machinery, not even horses or mules or oxen could cross the moonscape. And Billy and the Maori and others helping them with their particular hole came at last to a membrane of timbers laced over rocks, which had wedged together to form an accidental dome. They made a hole in the membrane. There was darkness and space under there. A German soldier with a flashlight went down into the darkness, was gone a long time. When he finally came back, he told his superior on the rim of the hole that there were dozens of bodies down there. They were sitting on benches. They were unmarked. So it goes. The superior said that the opening in the membrane should be enlarged and that a ladder should be put in the hole so that bodies could be carried out. Thus began the corpse mine in Dresden. So that's really Kurt Vonnegut's experience as a real person, putting it into this book. If you notice, I said "so it goes" in there. You'll hear that phrase over and over again throughout the book. Every time someone dies or he talks about death, that phrase is used, "so it goes." So the story starts out with a narrator, and the narrator is, let's see. It is Billy Pilgrim. Is that? No, it doesn't say that on the slide, but it's Billy Pilgrim. And in the introduction, he tells someone that he's writing a book, an anti-war book, and the guy just laughs, and he's like, why would you write an anti-war book? You might as well write an anti-glacier book. So I want you to think about that for a minute. There's no way that you can write an anti-glacier book, right? Like a book against glaciers that don't exist. And so I want you to think about what the person might have meant when he said, well, you might as well write an anti-glacier book as write an anti-war book. And this again gets to this concept of free will versus fate. And are we condemned to war and things like that? So the first chapter, let's see here. Well, we kind of know that this book is it's about Vonnegut a lot. And he uses that sentence that you see, that was I, that was me, that was the author of this book. And so while Billy Pilgrim is writing the book, it kind of looks like it's Billy Pilgrim who says this, but it's probably Kurt Vonnegut who says this on page, it's 125 in my edition, 124 of the book that's in the library. So we know there's a lot of Vonnegut in here. The first chapter, I love how the first chapter ends, and so I want to read that to you. So Billy Pilgrim wants to write this anti-war book to kind of get it out, to get all his feelings out. And he ends the first chapter this way. People aren't supposed to look back. I'm certainly not going to do it anymore. I finished my war book now. The next one I write is going to be fun. This one is a failure. And it had to be, since it was written by a pillar of salt. Pillar of salt, looking back from the Bible. It begins like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. It ends like this. Poo ti wheat. And so that's exactly how the book begins. Chapter 2 begins, listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. And the last sentence is poo ti wheat. And so now we got to figure out what happens in between. Oh, here we go. There it is right there. So Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. And so It's hard to explain this book because it does not follow a linear fashion. It doesn't say, here's what happened, and then here's what happened, and then here's what happened. Billy Pilgrim jumps all around in time. He goes to the future, he goes to the past, he goes to the war, he goes to the current day in 69, goes back to the future. So it's hard to keep all the things in your head, and it's probably going to be even more confusing as I try to explain it. But certainly that's the case in this book, and that's why it may be science fiction. When the book is written, at the time the book is written, Billy Pilgrim is an optometrist in a small town in New York. In World War II, he was a chaplain's assistant. He got captured, like you see there, sent to Dresden, and he was housed in an unused slaughterhouse. This is why you get the name SL5. This is the name of the slaughterhouse that the prisoners of war were held in Dresden. And he hid in a deep cellar when the bombing began with, guess who? Germans, his enemy, their enemy, our enemy, whatever that means. He was down in the meat locker, Vonnegut writes, on the night that Dresden was destroyed. There were sounds like giant footsteps above. Those were sticks of high explosive bombs. The giants walked and walked. The meat locker was a very safe shelter. All that happened down there was an occasional shower of calcimine. The Americans and 4 of their guards and a few dressed carcasses were down there, nobody else. The rest of the guards had, before the raid began, gone to the comforts of their own homes in Dresden. They were all being killed with their families. So it goes. Okay. So, again, Billy Pilgrim becomes unstuck in time. There's no linear sequence of events in the book. He gets abducted by aliens, Billy does, by aliens called the Tralfalmadorians. The Tralfalmadorians are, and we'll talk a lot about them, but one of the things that they see in 4 dimensions, and they see all moments in time. So they always know what has happened, and they always know what is happening, and they always know what will happen. And we'll talk about what that means to them and to us in a little bit. They also have, I think they have their eyes in their hands. No, that's not true. They do something with their hands when they're amused or something. I'm sure they'll get to us in one of the segments I'm going to read to you. Anyways, Billy Pilgrim gets abducted by them, and he's put like in a zoo on the planet Tralfalmador. And here's what happens to him there at one point. And Billy traveled in time to the zoo on Tralfalmador. He was 44 years old, on display under a geodesic dome. He was reclining on the lounge chair which had been his cradle during his trip through space. He was naked. The Tralfalmadorians were interested in his body, all of it. There were thousands of them outside, holding up their little hands so their eyes could see. Yes, so they have their eyes in their hands. Billy had been on Tralfalmador for 6 Earthling months now. He was used to the crowd. Escape was out of the question. The atmosphere outside the dome was cyanide. And the Earth was whatever billion miles away. Billy was displayed there in the zoo in a simulated Earthling habitat. Most of the furnishings had been stolen from the Sears Roebuck warehouse in Iowa City, Iowa. There was a color television set and a couch that could be converted into a bed. There were end tables with lamps and ashtrays on them by the couch. There was a home bar and 2 stools. There was a little pool table. There was wall-to-wall carpeting in federal gold, except in the kitchen and bathroom areas and over the iron manhole cover in the center of the floor. There were magazines arranged in a fan on the coffee table in front of the couch. There was a stereophonic phonograph. The phonograph worked, the television didn't. There was a picture of one cowboy killing another one pasted to the television tube. So it goes. There were no walls in the dome, no place for Billy to hide. The mint green bathroom fixtures were right out in the open. Billy got off his lounge chair now, went to the bathroom and took a leak. The crowd went wild. Billy brushed his teeth on Tralfalmador, put in his partial denture, and went into his kitchen. His bottled gas range and his refrigerator and his dishwasher were mint green too. There was a picture painted on the door of the refrigerator. The refrigerator had come that way. It was a picture of a 1890s couple on a bicycle built for two. Billy looked at the picture now, tried to think something about the couple. Nothing came to him. There didn't seem to be anything to think about these two people. And so we'll get back to that. They gave him they abducted a movie star and gave it to him. Um, yeah, so there you go. So once again, one interesting aspect of the Tralfamadorians is that they could see all moments of life at all times. And they tried to explain this to Billy. And here we go. Here's this segment. There was a lot that Billy said that was gibberish to the Tralfamadorians, too. They couldn't imagine what time looked like to him. Billy had given up on explaining that. The guide outside had to explain as best he could. The guide invited the crowd to imagine that they were looking across a desert at a mountain range on a day that was twinkling bright and clear. They could look at a peak or a bird or a cloud, at a stone right in front of them, or even down into a canyon behind them. But among them was this poor earthling, and his head was encased in a steel sphere, which he could never take off. There was only one eye hole through which he could look, and welded to that eye hole were 6 feet of pipe. This was only the beginning of Billy's miseries in the metaphor. He was also strapped to a steel lattice, which was bolted to a flat car on rails, and there was no way he could turn his head or touch the pipe. The far end of the pipe rested on a bipod, which was also bolted to the flat car, and Billy could see what all Billy could see was the little dot at the end of the pipe. He didn't know he was on a flat car, didn't even know there was anything peculiar about his situation. The flat car sometimes crept, sometimes went extremely fast, often stopped, went uphill, downhill, around curves, along straightaways. Whatever poor Billy saw through the pipe, he had no choice but to say to himself, "That's life." And so, if all Billy was seeing was what he could see at the end of the 6-foot pipe bolted to a flat car, while the Tralfamadorians saw everything around all the time. So what are the implications of this if you think about your life or about the world in which we live, is if all we can see is this little point and we don't see what else is all around us? What are the implications of that? What's going on in the world that we just don't even see? What's going on with each other that we don't even see? Like, we're so focused on what's at the end of the 6-foot pipe. Yes, I should just tell you about the book. I'm getting too far ahead, but this gets really interesting. Billy expected the Tralfamadorians to be baffled and alarmed by all the wars and other forms of murder on Earth. He expected them to fear that the Earthling combination of ferocity and spectacular weaponry might eventually destroy part or maybe all of the innocent universe. Science fiction had led him to believe that. But the subject of war never came up until Billy brought it up himself. Somebody in the zoo crowd asked him through the lecturer what the most valuable thing he had learned on Tralfamador was so far. And Billy replied, "How the inhabitants of a whole planet can live in peace. As you know, I am from a planet that has been engaged in senseless slaughter since the beginning of time. I myself have seen the bodies of schoolgirls who were boiled alive in a water tower by my own countrymen, who were proud of fighting pure evil at the time." This was true. Billy saw the boiled bodies in Dresden. "And I have lit my way in a prison at night with candles from the fat of human beings who were butchered by the brothers and fathers of those schoolgirls who were boiled. Earthlings must be the terrors of the universe. If other planets aren't now in danger from Earth, they soon will be. So tell me the secret so I can take it back to Earth and save us all. How can a planet live at peace?" Billy felt that he had spoken soaringly. He was baffled when he saw the Tralfamadorians close their little hands on their eyes. He knew from past experience what this meant. He was being stupid. "Would you mind telling me," he said to the guide, much deflated, "what was so stupid about that?" "We know how the universe ends," said the guide, "and Earth has nothing to do with it, except that it gets wiped out, too." We'll get back to that. We'll get back to the Tralfamadorians. Billy really has no emotional connections to people around him. His wife really has no connections to. They have a couple kids. We'll talk about one of his kids in a little bit. His wife dies, though. This is how he dies. Somewhere in the book, Billy goes on goes to an optometrist conference, and they get on the plane. The plane crashes into a mountain, but he survives, and he knows he's going to survive because he can travel. He can travel to the point of his death or point of his birth or whatever. So it doesn't matter. He knows that he's not going to die. But he gets taken to the hospital. His wife's name is Valencia. He was unconscious. Billy was unconscious in the hospital in Vermont after the airplane crashed on Sugar Bush Mountain, and Valencia, having heard about the crash, was driving from Ilium to the hospital in the family Cadillac Eldorado Coupe de Ville. Valencia was hysterical because she had been told, frankly, that Billy might die, or that if he lived, he might be a vegetable. Valencia adored Billy. She was crying and yelping so hard as she drove that she missed the correct turnoff from the thruway. She applied her power brakes, and a Mercedes slammed into her from behind. Nobody was hurt, thank God, because both drivers were wearing seatbelts. Thank God, thank God. The Mercedes lost only a headlight, but the rear end of the Cadillac was a body and fender man's wet dream. The trunk and fenders were collapsed. The gaping trunk looked like a mouth of a village idiot who was explaining that he didn't know anything about anything. The fenders shrugged. The bumper was at a high port arms. Reagan for president, its sticker on the bumper said. The back window was veined with cracks. The exhaust system rested on the pavement. The driver of the Mercedes got out and went to Valencia to find out if she was all right. She blabbed hysterically about Billy and the airplane crash, and then she put her car in gear and crossed the median divider, leaving her exhaust system behind. When she arrived at the hospital, people rushed to the windows to see what all the noise was. The Cadillac, with both mufflers gone, sounded like a heavy bomber coming in on a wing and a prayer. Valencia turned off the engine, but then she slumped against the steering wheel and the horn brayed steadily. A doctor and a nurse ran out to find out what the trouble was. Poor Valencia was unconscious, overcome by carbon monoxide. She was a heavenly azure. 1 hour later, she was dead. So it goes. Let's talk about Billy's son, Robert. And I love this paragraph that I'm about to read you. Robert was always disappointing to Billy. And so I want you, after I read, there's just 2 paragraphs here about Robert, and tell me why you think, no, you can't tell me, obviously, because you're there and I'm here, but think about why you think Billy might think his son is disappointing. Billy Pilgrim opened his eyes in the hospital in Vermont, did not know where he was. Watching him was his son, Robert. Robert was wearing the uniform of the famous Green Berets. This is Vietnam era. Robert's hair was short and wheat-colored bristles. Robert was clean and neat. He was decorated with a purple heart and a silver star and a bronze star with 2 clusters. This was a boy who had flunked out of high school, who had been an alcoholic at 16, who had run with a rotten bunch of kids, who had been arrested for tipping over hundreds of tombstones in a Catholic cemetery one time. He was all straightened out now. His posture was wonderful, and his shoes were shined, and his trousers were pressed, and he was a leader of men. So why would Robert be disappointing to Billy? And I want you to think about the concept of being a leader of men and where Robert was leading people at the time, and what maybe our leaders do, and why that might be disappointing to Billy. Let's switch to another character, Edgar Derby. You can see who Edgar Derby was, and I don't want to talk too much about him. He was a high school teacher. He saw his students being sent off to war, and he decided that he couldn't send his students off without going himself. He was a prisoner of war with Billy, and he said he's the only person to understand what war can do to people. And Vonnegut has said in after he wrote the book, that this story was really the climax of the book, which is right at the end, the last couple pages. And it's because what happens to Edgar Derby is this, and you can see it there in the second to last bullet point. There were hundreds of corpse mines operating by and by. There, he's back in Dresden at this point. They didn't smell bad at first, were wax museums, but then the bodies rotted and liquefied, and the stink was like roses and mustard gas. So it goes. The Maori Billy had worked with died on the dry heaves after having been ordered to go down in that stink and work. He tore himself to pieces, throwing up and throwing up. So it goes. So a new technique was devised. Bodies weren't brought up anymore. They were cremated by soldiers with flamethrowers right where they were. The soldiers stood outside the shelter, simply sent the fire in. Somewhere in there, the poor high school teacher, Edgar Derby, was caught with a teapot he had taken from the catacombs. He was arrested for plundering. He was tried and shot. So it goes. So if this is the climax of the story and what war can do to people is, I mean, just imagine the scene of the 100,000 bodies liquefying, being burned in their places and all of that. And this guy steals a teapot and he's executed. And so where is the moral justice, the balance that probably should be occurring here? And certainly the value of life is non-existent at that time. I wanted to talk a little bit about Roland. Roland is one of Billy's best friends, and he saves Billy several times during the war and while they were prisoners. He dies of gangrene, and Billy, he, let's see, he gets killed by another soldier. Let's see what I got here. This is how Billy dies. It's funny, on page 141, this is about halfway through the book, Billy says this: I, Billy Pilgrim, will die, have died, and will always die on February 13th, 1976. At the time of his death, he says he's in Chicago to address a large crowd on the subject of flying saucers and the true nature of time. His home is still in Ilium. He had to cross 3 international borders in order to reach Chicago. The United States has been balkanized, has been divided into 20 petty nations so that it will never again be a threat to world peace. Think about that. So Billy's speaking there. There are protests. Billy says, if you protest, if you think that death is a terrible thing, then you have not understood a word I've said. And he closes his speech, as he closes every speech, with these words: farewell, farewell, hello, farewell, hello. There are police around him as he leaves the stage. They are there to protect him from the crush of popularity. No threats on his life have been made since 1945. The police offer to stay with him. They are thwartedly willing to stand in a circle around him all night. No, no, says Billy. It's time for you to go home to your wives and children, and it's time for me to be dead for a little while, and then live again. At that moment, Billy's high forehead is in the crosshairs of a high-powered laser gun. It is aimed at him from the darkened press box, and the next moment, Billy Pilgrim is dead. So it goes. So Billy experiences death for a while. It is simply violent and hum. There isn't anybody else there. Not even Billy Pilgrim is there. And it's Lazaro who kills him. I don't know why I told that story, but that's how Billy dies. But there's something that I really need to tell you, and I don't see it here. Yeah, so when we talk about this concept of fate versus free will, it was back to that question that Billy asked about how do you live a peaceful world? How do you get a peaceful world? And the Tralfamadorians say, we know how the universe ends, and the earth has nothing to do with it except that it gets wiped out too. And Billy asks the question, how does the universe end? And the Tralfamadorians respond, we blow it up and experimenting with new fuels for our flying saucers. A Tralfamadorian test pilot presses a starter button and the whole universe disappears. So it goes. If you know this, said Billy, isn't there some way you can prevent it? Can't you keep the pilot from pressing the button? He has always pressed it, and he always will. We always let him and always will let him. The moment is structured that way. So, said Billy gropingly, I suppose that the idea of preventing war on Earth is stupid too. Of course. But you do have a peaceful planet here. Today we do. On other days we have wars as horrible as any you've ever seen or read about. There isn't anything we can do about them, so we simply don't look at them. We ignore them. We spend eternity looking at pleasant moments, like today at the zoo. Isn't this a nice moment? Yes, said Billy. That's one thing Earthlings might learn to do, if they tried hard enough. Ignore the awful times and concentrate on the good ones. So think about that. I mean, and you can see here this quote, the Tralfamadorians said that they visited 131 planets in the universe, and only on Earth is there talk of free will. And so, I mean, think of the implications of this. Do we have the power to control our destinies and our actions? Or should we just accept that there are going to be sad things and difficult things that happen and then focus on the good things? And you know some people who say that. And this is what is kind of talked about in the book. But then I also want to tell you this. So there's this. Everyone is always alive in Tralfamador because they can see everything all the time. The phrase "so it goes" appears 160 or so times in the book. That means there's 160 or so references in a book that's only 200 pages long. And you can see the Tralfamadorians say we spend eternity looking at the pleasant moments. So that's nice. And I wonder if we can learn from that. But I also want to introduce you to this concept of a satire. So a satire is the use of irony or sarcasm or ridicule to kind of point out how something is ridiculous. And some people claim that this book is not any of the things I said before. Some people say that it's a satire about this argument between fate and free will, and that maybe this concept of ignoring the bad and focusing on the good might just be ridiculous. Because we get back to Derby, and Campbell was another prisoner that was there with him. I think he was a prisoner, but he was a Nazi, an American Nazi. And him and Derby got into if you remember Derby, he's the one who got shot because he stole the teapot. And so Derby and Campbell get into an argument, and you can see here Derby raised his head, called Campbell a snake. He corrected that. He said that snakes couldn't help being snakes, and that Campbell, who could help being what he was something much lower than a snake or a rat, or even a blood-filled tick. And so now this little phrase helps us maybe to think about, can we actually have an impact on who we are? So he said snakes can't help being snakes, but can we help being warmongering killers? And if we can, then that would tilt the story and the philosophy over to the concept of free will, that we could stop some of these things. So do we have fate or free will? These are some things that we can talk about. Or do we spend too much time focusing on the bad? Can we stop conflict and violence and all of these things? Can we stop war? If not, why not? And I think you can make a great argument in your analysis about these things. So hopefully you enjoyed this book. Like I said, it's in the library. It's only a couple hundred pages. It's fantastic. If you don't want to read this one because I just told you the story, then check out a book called Cat's Cradle. That's more about the Cold War, I think. But it's fantastic, and I think you would enjoy it. So thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time.